Hello everybody. This is lesson 2 of the lecture International Economics. I will discuss slide 47 to 72. So far we have figured out that the area below the demand curve and above the market price can be interpreted as consumer surplus, while the area below the market price and above the supply curve can be interpreted as producer surplus. If this diagram describes the market for a certain good in a country which is not engaged in international trade, we call such a state autarky. Let's assume in the following that the good which is traded on this market are refrigerators. So the yellow and the green triangle represent consumer and producer surplus on the market for refrigerators in this country in the state of autarky. The equilibrium price in the state of autarky is called the autarky price in the following. What happens now if this country leaves the state of autarky and opens for free trade with the rest of the world? To answer this question, we have to distinguish two possibilities. In the first one, the world market price lies below the autarky price. In the second one, the world market price lies above the autarky price. Let's start with the case where the world market price lies below the autarky price. Let's further assume that the country we talk about is so small compared to the world market that the world market price for refrigerators does not change if this country buys more or less refrigerators. Consequently, the world market price is given by a horizontal line in the diagram. No matter how much refrigerators our country buys, the world market price stays always unchanged. Under these assumptions, consumers will have the chance to buy refrigerators at the lower world market price. So they are no longer willing to pay the higher autarky price. According to their demand curve, consumers will demand also a higher consumption quantity as under autarky conditions. As a result, producers will have no other choice as to accept the lower world market price. Therefore, they will reduce their production quantity to a level where their marginal costs equal the world market price. This production level is given by the intersection between the world market price and the supply curve here. The difference between the higher domestic consumption demand and the lower domestic production supply is now satisfied by imports from the world market. This is the new market equilibrium with international trade. We can now compare the distribution of consumer and producer welfare in autarky and under free trade. To do so, it is useful to name these areas with these capital letters A, B, D and C. In the initial state of autarky, consumer surplus equals the area A, while producer surplus equals B plus C. This is displayed by the second column of the table. Consumer surplus under autarky is A, producer surplus under autarky is B plus C, total surplus is A plus B plus C. Under free international trade, consumers gain the area B and D because of the lower world market price and the higher consumption quantity. This is displayed by the third column of the table here. Consumer surplus is A plus B plus D, A plus B plus D. Producer surplus is just C. Total surplus is A plus B plus C plus D. Producers, however, lose the area B and keep only the area C. If we calculate the change of consumer surplus in the last column, we observe that the area B is redistributed from producers to consumers, while the area D is an additional surplus made possible by the cheap supply from the world market. If we rely on the normative decision that welfare of producers should have the same weight as the welfare of consumers, the net effect of a transition to free trade is positive, since consumers gain more surplus as producers lose. Hence, the area D is a net gain. However, such a normative decision is not binding. We will later discuss alternative normative decisions. There is no unopposed scientific method available to decide which kind of normative decision is correct. Hence, such a decision depends, in last instance, on personal value judgments. We will come back to this problem. To sum up, the transition of whole countries from autarky to free trade, and not only single countries or single persons like Fred and Barney, generates winners and losers. If the world market price is below the autarky price, consumers will be the winners and producers will be the losers. However, if we evaluate the surplus of consumers and producers equally, the net effect on total welfare is positive. Consumers gain more as producers lose. The consumers' gain is part of the former producer surplus, area B, plus additional surplus from the consumption of the imports, area D. Since producers produce less as before, they will typically demand less production factors, especially labor force. If these workers cannot immediately find a new job at the old wage rate, additional welfare losses might emerge. Next, we have to analyze the other possibility where the world market price is higher than the autarky price. Let's analyze now how this changes the surplus of consumers and producers. Under these assumptions, producers will have the chance to sell refrigerators at the higher world market price. Here. So, they are no longer willing to sell refrigerators at the lower autarky price. According to their supply curve, producers will supply a higher production quantity as under autarky conditions here. As a result, consumers will have no other choice as to accept the higher world market price. Therefore, they will reduce their consumption quantity to this level. This consumption level is given by the intersection point between the world market price and the demand curve. Okay. The difference between the higher domestic production level and the lower domestic consumption demand is explained by exports to the world market. This is the new market equilibrium with international trade. We can now compare the distribution of consumer and producer welfare in autarky and under free international trade. To do so, it is again useful to name these areas with capital letters, like this. In the initial state of autarky, consumer surplus equals area C plus A, while producer surplus equals area B, this triangle. This is displayed by the second column of the table. Autarky, consumer surplus C plus A, producer surplus B. Total surplus C plus A plus B. Under free international trade, consumers lose the area A because of the higher world market price and their lower consumption quantity. This is displayed by the third column of the table here. They have now only consumer surplus C left. Producers gain area A and D. This area plus this triangle here. In the table we find it here. Producer surplus is now equal to B plus A plus D. So this whole large triangle. If we calculate the change of consumer surplus in the last column, we observe that area A is redistributed from consumers to producers. Here it changes to producers. While area D is additional surplus made possible by the lucrative additional demand from the world market. If we rely again on the normative decision that the welfare of producers should have the same weight as the welfare of consumers, the net effect of a transition to free trade is positive, since producers gain more surplus as consumers lose. Hence, the area D is a net gain. However, we know that such a normative decision is not binding for reasons already mentioned, and we will come back to this problem soon. To sum up, the transition of a whole country from autarky to free trade generates winners and losers. If the world market price is above the autarky price, producers will be the winners and consumers will be the losers. However, the net effect on total welfare is positive. Producers gain more as consumers lose. The producers gain apart from the former consumer surplus, area B, plus additional surplus from the exports of goods, area D. In principle, the winners gain enough to compensate the losers for their losses and still keep a surplus compared to autarky. There is, however, no mechanism which keeps care for such a compensation of losers. From a pure scientific point of view, there exists no necessity to make the transition from autarky to free trade. A normative decision has to be made. For example, according to a normative principle called Pareto principle, a change shall always be made if it improves the situation of at least one person without worsen the situation of another person. Consequently, a transition from autarky to free trade cannot be made if you rely on the Pareto principle. Since the loser of free trade will not be compensated by the winners, a transition from autarky to free trade does simply not correspond with the Pareto principle. This is Vilfredo Pareto, an Italian economist living in the 19th century. The English economists Kaldor and Hicks proposed another normative principle which allows a transition from autarky to free trade. It's called the Kaldor-Hicks criterion. According to this, a change shall always be made if the winners of this change can potentially compensate the losers and still keep a net gain. Compensation is, however, not necessary. This normative principle applies another value judgment, since it accepts that losers are not compensated. There are certainly ethical value systems with which this is not compatible. Not everybody will therefore accept the Kaldor-Hicks criterion. Of course, a lot of alternative normative criteria are also possible. One such example would be the following modified Kaldor-Hicks criterion. Consists of the original Kaldor-Hicks criterion plus the supplement no loser shall ever face an existential threat. You have to find out what normative value judgment fits best to your personal value system. To make up your mind, it is probably useful to consider the different consequences of a transition from autarky to free trade depending on the degree of economic development. For example, farmers in a developed country with a well-functioning social security system, financial sector and education system might suffer from a transition to free trade, but they will not face an existential threat. The security system will provide them a minimum income, and the education system and the possibility to receive credits will allow them to find a new job or reorganize their production. If, however, farmers in a developing country have to close their production because of new competition from a transition to free trade, their families will very often face an existential threat, since they cannot rely on a social security system, the possibility to receive credits or vocational training. As always, when it comes to ethical value judgments, the existence of universally binding rules is incapable of proof. In last instance, everybody has to make a personal decision. However, if decisions are inevitable which concern the whole society, societal compromises have to be found. Therefore, the interests of consumers and producers have to be balanced somehow. In a constitutional democracy, this is the task of parliaments. So much for this lesson. In the next lesson, we will discuss the economic reasons why the world market price and the autarky price can differ.